the mental version of irritable bowel syndrome. This is the Daniel Natal Show. An article was brought to my attention. It's entitled "An Algorithm That Screens for Child Neglect Raises Concerns." In it, we read, inside a cavernous stone fortress in downtown Pittsburgh, attorney Robin Frank defends parents at one of their lowest points when they're at risk of losing their children. The job is never easy, but in the past, she knew what she was up against when squaring off against Child Protective Services in family court. Now she worries she's fighting something she can't see. An opaque algorithm whose statistical calculations help social workers decide which families will have to endure the rigors of the child welfare system, and which will not. A lot of people don't know that it's even being used, Frank said. Families should have the right to have all of the information in their file. As we segue into the Great Reset, and many of our politicians sing the praises of Chinese-style social credit systems, something bears pointing out. The fight of our generation is against technocracy. Many in the counterfeit conservative sphere are pretending as if the fight is still against communism. They have these elaborate debates on capitalism versus communism. They want us distracted from the emerging technocracy, so they have us preoccupied with things that are as irrelevant as the dangers of flappers. Here's the thing. In case you haven't noticed, the communist takeover already happened. Back in the 1930s, to placate radicals, Western governments turned into welfare states, adopting many of the tenets of Karl Marx. They figured that if they gave the people at least a little socialism, then it might stave off more virulent forms. Incrementally, though, a little socialism turned into a whole lot of it. Look at all the planks of the Communist Manifesto that we already have embraced, from centralized control of education to a graduated income tax. And speaking of that income tax, it was by this method that they stripped away people's ability to own property. Your grandparents and great-grandparents all owned land. They weren't any smarter than you. They were merely taxed less. In accordance with Marxist principles, property taxes and a million other taxes like a federal income tax were applied, and suddenly no one could afford land anymore. Communists were happy because property rights were, for the overwhelming majority of the population, stripped away. Destitute in old age because of this, the state had to start offering pensions to this dispossessed people. This had a side benefit. It made the population more dependent on the government. For the people, though, it came with a liability. 9/10 of human rights are based on the concept of property rights. People who lose their property will soon discover that the state no longer recognizes their human rights, the main one being the sovereignty over one's own body. But we communized in an even more profound sense, and not because of overt government policies, but because of technology. Let me explain. One of the main tenets of communism was the workers owning the means of production. Back in 1840, this was unthinkable. But reflect. Today, due to lower costs and higher quality, tech brings the means of production into the hands of average people. Think of Orson Welles making a movie in 1940. He picked an extremely expensive art form. The equipment was exorbitant, and only the studios could afford the prohibitive costs of cameras and the crews to man them, etc. Now, with digital technology, anyone can make a movie. Look at an indie production like the Blair Witch Project, which was made on a shoestring budget and grossed $250 million. Likewise, instead of having to go to an expensive recording studio to make an audiobook, average people can record them in their own homes with a mixing board that costs a couple $100. Think of the world of manufacturing opening up now due to 3D printing as well. At any rate, yes, the foundational tenet of communism, the workers owning the means of production, actually happened, and not due to a revolution, but due to technology changing. Karl Marx was wrong about one thing, though. Marx erroneously predicted that the big class struggle would be between the workers and the owner of a company. At the time, Marx couldn't have foreseen the rise of a third class, a manager class. This happened because companies evolved. Instead of a single owner, like Henry Ford, the advent of stock shares diluted the ownership of a corporation. So instead of a single monolithic owner, there were now millions of owners. Suffice it to say, millions of shareholders can't weigh in on day-to-day operations in a company, so this led to a new management structure, where CEOs and other managers in the C-suite took over the day-to-day operations on behalf of the shareholders. So now you didn't have two elements, labor and owners, but a third new management class. One of the memory-hold conservative intellectuals from the first half of the 20th century was James Burnham. He wrote a fantastic book in 1941 called The Managerial Revolution. In it, he correctly predicts a lot of stuff that's unfolding now, like how new manager classes throughout society are affecting social changes on any number of fronts, like Trump's war against the bureaucracy, which he called the deep state. This new class of unelected bureaucrats thought that they should be in charge, not any elected representative of the people, and they rose to power for the same reason that the C-suite did in corporations, diffuse ownership. With 340 million shareholders in America, called voters, responsibility was diluted, inviting managers to step into the void. As in the corporate sector, the managerial class and the public sector began to take control. Burnham makes an interesting point. That we're in a historical period as disruptive as when in the 1600s a new capitalist class unseated the aristocracy and the feudal system. Now, a new disruption is happening, where the capitalist class is being deposed by a new management class. And according to Burnham, in all societies where the managerial class takes over, you usually see them crushing capitalism and taking away property rights.
The capitalists of the 16th century were, we might say, carrying on a triple battle against the feudal lords, whose interests were bound up with the decaying social order, against the masses who, though obscurely, were a social force working against oppression and class rule of any kind, and against each other for first prizes in the New World. The battle was carried on with the help of dictatorial political methods. The feudal lords were reduced to social impotence. The struggle with the masses continued always in one way or another, but, after armed and bloody suppressions, and above all, after the new capitalist institutions and new ideologies contributing to the defense of these institutions became consolidated, was less acute. The third aspect of the triple battle went on, though after the reduction to a subordinate place of Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Germany, and as long as many new sections of the world remained open for adventure, it, too, was less sharp and dangerous. With the firm consolidation of the new society, the dictatorial political systems began to give way, sometimes gradually, sometimes to the accompaniment of civil wars, to democratic systems. Today, the managers are carrying on a similar triple battle. Let us recall here, as always when we use the language of the class struggle, the partly metaphorical character of that language. Against the capitalists, whose interests are bound up with the decaying social order, against the masses, who, obscurely, are a social force tending against oppression and class rule of any kind, and against each other for first prizes in the New World. The hold of the capitalists on the instruments of production must be smashed. The masses must be curbed, and as many as possible of them diverted, so that their weight is thrown into the scale on the side of the managers and of the new social structure. The capitalists will be eliminated or rendered impotent and negligible. The new institutions and ideologies will be consolidated on an at least semi-stable basis. The masses will be curbed, partly by armed suppression, partly through the consolidation of the managerial institutions and ideologies.
In that passage, notice how Burnham mentioned the management class eradicating property rights and making the populace dependent on the managers. This is why Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum said that by 2030, you would own nothing and be happy. One of the managing directors of the World Economic Forum is Larry Fink of BlackRock. BlackRock is an asset management company with over $11 trillion under management, making it richer than every country on Earth except for the United States and China. BlackRock is pushing a new social credit system called ESG, which stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance, and it's extorting smaller institutions to go along with new ESG protocols. So with all due respect to the counterfeit conservatives out there, usually funded by the management class, who want us to be distracted and still think like it's 1910 and communism is our big threat, think again. Communism, for lack of a better word, already happened. The battle for our generation is against technocracy, against social credit systems, against human medical experimentation and transhumanism, against what James Burnham calls the Managerial Revolution. Look at BlackRock's very organizational structure. They're an asset manager. They're the management class that Burnham warned about. And because of this coup, we have things like the article we started out with, where parents are having their children taken away due to algorithms. By the use of computers, the management class can evade accountability and hide behind a shield. A technocracy, where you can't vote out the people running the society, and from whose rulings there is no appeal. The point is, don't get distracted by Pied Pipers whose job is to sidetrack you and divert you from the actual fight. If you like what you're hearing in my show, be sure to check out The New American's other great shows. Behind the Deep State's one of them, hosted by Alex Newman. In his show, Alex exposes shady characters, organizations, and agendas that the elites don't want you to know about. Check it out on thenewamerican.com.